When she texted me it was over, and my parents told me to throw away Grandpa's books, my heart sank. I thought my life was over. What I didn't know was that fate had already started writing me a check for millions. You know that feeling when your whole world comes crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane? Yeah, that was me 3 months ago. Ben Martinez, 32 years old, working at Henderson's Rare Books on Newbury Street in Boston. Not exactly what you call a success story by American standards, right? My family never let me forget it either. Every Sunday dinner was like a personal roast where I was the main course. My older brother Jake, Harvard Law, corner office, BMW in the driveway, would lean back in his chair with that smug smile and drop gems like, "Still playing with dusty old books, Ben." My parents would nod along like bobbleheads, probably wondering where they went wrong with their younger son. The thing is, I genuinely loved what I did. There's something magical about holding a first edition, feeling the weight of history in your hands. Most people see dollar signs. I saw stories, adventures, whole worlds waiting to be discovered. But try explaining that at a family barbecue in suburban Massachusetts. Might as well tell them you're planning to become a professional unicorn trainer. Then life decided to play its favorite game. Kick the guy while he's down. It started with Grandpa Joe's funeral. God, I love that old man. While everyone else in the family was busy climbing their respective ladders of success, Grandpa Joe was the only one who got it. He'd sit in his cluttered study, surrounded by towers of books that looked like they might topple over and bury him alive, and he'd tell me stories that would make Indiana Jones jealous. "Ben," he'd say, his eyes twinkling behind those thick glasses, "real treasure isn't always shiny. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, disguised as junk that nobody wants." The funeral was your typical New England affair, gray skies, gray faces, and enough fake sympathy to fill Fenway Park. I stood there watching them lower the only person who believed in me into the ground, feeling like somebody had just turned off the last light in a very dark room. But the real gut punch came during the service. I overheard my cousin Sarah whisper to her husband, "At least Joe didn't waste the house on Ben." Can you imagine the way she said it? Like I was some kind of charity case who couldn't be trusted with real property. That's when it hit me. Even at his funeral, they were already calculating who deserved what, and I clearly wasn't on the list. But life wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, not even close. 2 days after we buried Grandpa Joe, I'm sitting in my cramped studio apartment, still processing the loss, when my phone buzzes. Emily, my girlfriend of 3 years, the woman I've been planning to propose to, the person I thought would be my anchor through this storm. Her text was colder than a Boston winter morning. "We need to talk. It's over, Ben. You used to dream so big. Now you just work in a basement bookstore and live in the past. I can't wait anymore for you to grow up and get a real future. Don't call me." Just like that. 3 years gone. Like deleting a file from your computer. I sat there staring at that message for what felt like hours, my brain trying to process what had just happened. The woman who used to laugh at my stories about rare book discoveries, who said she loved my passion for history, had just labeled me a failure and walked away. Through text message. Classy, right? But here's the kicker. When I finally worked up the courage to drive over to her place to get my stuff, my belongings were already sitting in garbage bags on her front steps. Like I was trash she couldn't wait to put out for collection. The humiliation was complete when she started dating my brother's law firm buddy 2 weeks later. Apparently, guys with six-figure salaries and zero personality are more attractive than guys who can tell you the fascinating history behind a 200-year-old cookbook. Who knew? But wait, there's more. Because apparently, the universe decided I needed a full-scale demolition of my life, not just partial destruction. The family gathered for the reading of Grandpa Joe's will. Everyone sitting around the lawyer's office, like vultures waiting for their slice of the pie. My cousins are probably already planning their European vacations. My brother's calculating potential investment returns. And my parents are trying to look appropriately sad while obviously thinking about retirement funds. Then the lawyer starts reading. Cousin Sarah gets the house. Brother Jake gets the car and some stocks. Various relatives get jewelry, artwork, and cash. Then he gets to my name. To my grandson Benjamin Martinez. I leave my personal library and all its contents. The lawyer paused and added, Mr. Joseph Martinez was very specific about this bequest. He refused several attempts by family members to modify this arrangement, stating that this inheritance wasn't about money, but about understanding. You could hear a pin drop. Then came the smirks, the exchanged glances, that quiet, condescending kind of laughter people say for moments they think they've won. Books. My dad chuckled, shaking his head. All those books. My mom patted my shoulder like I was a kid who'd just been told Santa wasn't real. Oh, honey, at least you can sell them for a few dollars. Maybe use the money for something practical. Jake didn't laugh. He just smiled the way someone does when they've just closed a particularly satisfying case. Well, Ben, I guess that's fitting. You always were Grandpa's little project. The way he said project made it sound like I was a broken appliance that needed fixing. I wanted to disappear. Here I was, dealing with heartbreak, grief, and unemployment. Yeah, I forgot to mention that Henderson's was closing down, because apparently nobody buys rare books anymore when they can just Google everything. And my own family was treating Grandpa Joe's most precious possession like it was a pile of recycling. But you know what hurt the most? They weren't entirely wrong. By conventional American success metrics, I was a complete washout, 32, single, jobless, and now the proud owner of what everyone considered a bunch of worthless old books. That night, I drove over to Grandpa Joe's house, well, Sarah's house now, to check out my inheritance. The key still worked, and I let myself into that familiar smell of old paper with polish and a faint trace of Grandpa Joe's pipe tobacco that somehow never quite faded from the walls. The library was exactly as he'd left it. Books everywhere on shelves and stacks on the floor, some balanced precariously on windowsills. It looked like a literary tornado had touched down and decided to stay. Most people would see chaos. I saw potential. I pulled out a leather-bound volume at random. Something about colonial American trade routes. The binding was cracked. The pages were yellowed, and it smelled like it had been buried in someone's attic for 50 years. My family would take one look at this and see garbage. But I saw history, stories, knowledge that somebody had cared enough to preserve. Sitting there in Grandpa Joe's old reading chair, surrounded by what everyone else called junk, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. For the first time since the funeral, since Emily's brutal text, since watching my life implode in spectacular fashion, I wasn't drowning in self-pity. I started pulling books off shelves randomly, not looking for anything specific, just browsing, like visiting old friends. A collection of Revolutionary War memoirs here, some early American poetry there, maritime histories, botanical guides, cookbooks that were older than our country. Each book was a doorway to a different world, a different time. While my family was busy counting their inheritance money and planning practical investments, I was traveling through centuries, meeting people who'd been dead for hundreds of years, learning their stories. Then something caught my eye. Tucked between 2 volumes of Boston maritime history, there was a small envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written on it in Grandpa Joe's distinctive handwriting. My heart started pounding as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with just one line. Not everything is on the surface, Ben. Start with the C. I stared at those words, my hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just some random note. This was deliberate, intentional. Grandpa Joe had left me more than just books. He'd left me a puzzle. I looked around the library with new eyes. All those stories he used to tell about hidden treasures, secret compartments, mysterious maps tucked away in unexpected places. What if they weren't just stories? What if the family was wrong to dismiss him as an eccentric old man who spent too much time reading adventure novels? Start with the C. I grabbed the maritime history book I'd been holding earlier. This time, when I opened it, I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a faint rustling sound, like something was sewn into the binding itself. The book felt heavier than it should have, and when I held it up to the light, I could see the shadow of something pressed between the back cover and the binding. My pulse quickened. This wasn't my imagination running wild after a devastating week. This was real, physical. Something was actually hidden in this book. I thought about Grandpa Joe's words. Real treasure isn't always shiny. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, disguised as junk that nobody wants. He'd been trying to tell me something all along, something the rest of the family was too busy or too skeptical to hear. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a purpose again. This wasn't just about escaping my problems or wallowing in nostalgia. This was about solving a mystery that my grandfather had specifically designed for me. I settled deeper into his reading chair and began examining the maritime history book more carefully. Every page, every illustration, looking for anything that might be out of place. The rustling sound was definitely coming from the back binding, and I could feel something thin and flat pressed against the inside cover. Whatever was hidden in there, Grandpa Joe had gone to considerable trouble to conceal it. This wasn't just a random bookmark or press flower. This was something he wanted to find. Something important enough that he'd turned his entire library into an elaborate treasure hunt. And you know what? For the first time since everything fell apart, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The family could keep their stocks in jewelry and real estate. I had something better. I had a mystery to solve, a connection to the one person who'd always believed in me, and the growing certainty that this old chair was about to become my launch pad into something far bigger than I'd ever imagined. I had no idea I was about to discover that sometimes the best revenge against people who've written you off is proving them spectacularly wrong. The book was heavier than it looked. Days blurred into nights as I practically lived in Grandpa Joe's library, chasing a whisper from the past. My fingers memorized every spine, every crack in the leather, like they were braille from another era. Somewhere in this house, the real treasure waited, and I was getting closer. Days blended into nights, nights into dawn. I practically lived in that library, surrounded by what everyone else considered paper waste. For me, though, this became my universe, my shield against the outside world and its merciless judgments. I'd run my fingers along each spine, breathe in their stories, feel the weight of centuries in my hands. It was my way of escaping reality, sure, but it was also my way of feeling Grandpa Joe's presence. Like he was sitting right there in his old leather chair, puffing on that pipe of his, quietly whispering, "Take your time, Ben. Everything has its moment." I knew Grandpa Joe had been a collector, but he never put his treasures on display like some people do with their fancy art or expensive watches. He used to say, "Real value isn't meant for show-off, kid. It's meant for the people who understand what they're looking at." Typical Grandpa Joe, always speaking in riddles that made perfect sense later. One evening, when the moon was peeking through the window and shadows were dancing their own mysterious ballet on the walls, I was examining that old Revolutionary War tome. The thing was heavy as a brick, bound in cracked leather that looked like it had witnessed actual battles. That's when I noticed it. This subtle, strange scent that wasn't the usual musty book smell. It wasn't decay or dust. It was something else entirely. Something that seemed to whisper secrets and hidden things. Not the smell of old paper. This was the smell of adventure itself. My heart started hammering like I'd just chugged 3 espressos. This wasn't just my imagination running wild after a brutal week. This was physical, real. Something was different about this book, and my grandfather, even from beyond the grave, was trying to tell me something. I stood there holding this book, feeling like a detective who just found his first real clue. The smell was faint but distinct, like something had been preserved inside the binding for decades. This wasn't random. Grandpa Joe had been too careful, too deliberate about everything he did. At first, I figured maybe this was just an incredibly rare first edition, one of those mythical books that collectors whisper about but never actually see. The kind of find that would make my family finally shut up for 5 minutes. I could already picture their faces, that mixture of shock and grudging respect, when I proved I wasn't just a dreamer playing with worthless junk. But I had no idea that the real treasure was buried much deeper, that this was just the opening note of a symphony that would completely transform my life. My hands were actually shaking as I carefully turned each page. And then, almost at the very end of the book, I saw it. A small piece of yellow parchment, pressed between the pages like a bookmark. But this wasn't just marking someone's place. This was covered in encrypted messages and strange symbols, all written in Grandpa Joe's unmistakable handwriting. It looked like a map, not some pirate treasure map from a kid's movie, but something far more sophisticated and infinitely more fascinating. This was a challenge to my intellect, a puzzle designed specifically for someone who understood books and history. I started working on decoding the message right there in his chair. Grandpa Joe, the man who taught me to spot a first edition from across a room and notice the subtle differences in binding techniques, was giving me one final lesson. I used everything I'd learned during my years at the bookstore, all those useless facts I collected, all that knowledge about paper types and printing methods that my family always rolled their eyes at. The code was tough. Sometimes I'd stare at a symbol for an hour, feeling like I was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But I refused to give up. Every decoded word felt like climbing another step towards something unknown but unmistakably important. Slowly, the pattern started emerging. The message was pointing to the hidden location of a unique collection of antique prints and maps. This was what Grandpa Joe had been hinting at all those years, what he tried to tell my family about, but nobody, absolutely nobody, had believed him. Old man's fantasy, they'd said. Joe's lost in his books again. But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just any collection. This was something priceless for historians and collectors, artifacts that were believed to be lost forever. These weren't just pretty pictures. These were witnesses to history itself. The decoded message gave me specific instructions for searching the house. Room by room, detail by detail. This wasn't just treasure hunting. This was following a carefully planned trail that my grandfather had spent years preparing. I started in the study naturally. If you were going to hide something in this house, that would be the logical place. But Grandpa Joe was smarter than logic. The first clue led me to the kitchen, of all places. Behind the old cast-iron stove, there was a loose brick that looked like it had been wiggled free and replaced countless times. Inside that hiding spot was another piece of parchment with more symbols and what looked like a rough sketch of the house's layout. But this wasn't your standard floor plan. It showed hidden spaces I never knew existed. Secret compartments built into the walls, concealed panels behind bookcases, even a small hidden room in the basement that wasn't on any official blueprint. This was like discovering that the house you'd visited hundreds of times was actually a completely different building. Grandpa Joe had turned his home into an elaborate puzzle box, and I was the only one with the key. The second clue took me to the living room, specifically to the old grandfather clock that hadn't worked in 20 years. But when I examined it more closely, following the cryptic directions, I found that the pendulum case opened to reveal another hiding spot, another message, another piece of the puzzle. Each discovery made my pulse race faster. This wasn't just about finding some valuable antiques anymore. This was about understanding that my grandfather had seen something in me that nobody else had. He trusted me with his greatest secret, his most precious legacy. The trail led me all over the house, to the basement, where a loose stone in the foundation concealed another clue, to the attic, where a message was hidden inside the frame of an old family photograph, even to his bedroom, where something was tucked behind a loose floorboard beneath his dresser. Every step of this journey felt surreal, like I was living inside one of those adventure novels I used to read as a kid, except this was real, and the treasure at the end belonged to me. But the strangest part was how natural it all felt, despite the complexity of the puzzle. Despite never having done anything like this before, I found myself thinking like Grandpa Joe, understanding his logic, anticipating his moves. It was like he'd been training me for this my entire life without me realizing it. All those hours we'd spent together, all those stories about hidden treasures and secret compartments, all those lessons about looking beyond the obvious. He'd been preparing me, teaching me to see what others missed, to value what others dismissed, to believe in possibilities that seemed impossible. The fourth clue brought me back to the library, but this time to a section I'd barely explored, his collection of Boston City directories and historical documents. Boring stuff that most people would flip through once and forget. But hidden inside a 1920s business directory was another encrypted message, more detailed than the others. This one included specific measurements, architectural details, and what looked like instructions for finding a concealed room somewhere in the house. The excitement was building with each discovery, but so was a realization of just how much thought and planning had gone into this. My grandfather hadn't just hidden a treasure. He'd created an entire experience, a journey of discovery that was as valuable as whatever waited at the end. This was his way of spending time with me one last time, of sharing his passion for mystery and adventure, of proving that the world still held wonders for those who knew how to look. Following his trail through the house felt like having a conversation with him. Every solved puzzle was his voice saying, "Good job, Ben. You're getting it. Keep going." The messages were leading me toward something specific, a location in the house that I was beginning to suspect held a real prize. But more than that, they were leading me toward a new understanding of myself. For the first time in weeks, I felt capable, smart, valuable. Every decoded symbol, every discovered hiding place, every step closer to the final answer was proof that I wasn't a failure my family thought I was. I was the one person in the world who could solve this puzzle, because I was the one person who truly understood its creator. As I worked through the night, surrounded by clues and maps and encrypted messages, I felt something shifting inside me. The grief and humiliation of the past weeks weren't gone, but they were being transformed into something else. Purpose, determination, the growing certainty that my grandfather had left me something far more valuable than money or property. He'd left me proof that I was exactly who he'd always believed I was. Someone who could see treasure where others saw trash. Someone who could solve mysteries that others couldn't even recognize existed. The final decoded message was the most complex, but also the most specific. It included precise measurements and architectural references that could only apply to one location in the house. The basement. Not just anywhere in the basement, but a specific wall that, according to Grandpa Joe's instructions, wasn't what it appeared to be. I made my way downstairs, flashlight in hand, following his directions step by step. The basement smelled like every old New England basement. Damp concrete, heating oil, and decades of stored memories gathering dust. But now I was looking at it with new eyes, not just as a storage space, but as a final destination of an incredible journey. The culmination of my grandfather's greatest secret and his deepest faith in me. Standing there in that basement, holding his final clue, I realized that this adventure, this treasure hunt through my own family's history, was changing me in ways I couldn't have imagined. Each step had been healing something broken inside me, rebuilding confidence that had been shattered. This was more than just walking through a house, following cryptic instructions. This was a real adventure, where past and present were meeting, where doubts were gradually dissolving like morning fog. And I was finally beginning to understand that whatever waited at the end of this trail was going to be worth every moment of pain that had led me here. I had no idea that the next few hours would completely redefine what I thought was possible in my life. The compartment was deeper than I expected. Reaching inside, I felt the cool edge of something wrapped in wax paper, brittle, fragile, and heavy with meaning. What I pulled out changed everything I thought I knew about this hunt. Another message, but this one was different, more elaborate, with detailed sketches and measurements that made my previous clues look like kindergarten homework. Turns out, Grandpa Joe wasn't just a book lover. He was a master of mind-bending puzzles. The encrypted message led me on a wild goose chase through every corner of that house, from an old wardrobe with cracked mirror, where I found a hidden compartment, to the basement where the next clue was tucked behind a dusty wine barrel, written on the back of a vintage label. This was a real-life escape room designed by my grandfather, like he wanted to test who among us was truly worthy of his legacy. Not the money, but the knowledge and the adventure. The guy had basically turned his entire house into one giant puzzle box, and I was the only person with even a chance of cracking it. The challenges kept escalating. Sometimes the clues were so obscure that I felt like a detective who'd hit a dead end in a case everyone else had given up on. One clue led me to his old globe. Looked totally ordinary at first glance. But Grandpa Joe always used to say, "The world isn't what it seems on the surface, Ben. You gotta know where to look." I spent 2 hours examining that globe before I noticed a tiny scratch on Australia. When I rotated it to a specific position, a small compartment opened up with the next riddle inside. This was a challenge to my brain and my creativity. I felt like I was playing a game where only one player knew the rules, Grandpa Joe, and I had to figure them out as I went along. The irony wasn't lost on me. I kept remembering how my family used to mock him, calling him a weirdo who wasted time hiding his junk around the house. My mom would always say, Joe could have been a millionaire if he hadn't spent so much time on his silly hobbies. Now that junk was becoming the key, not just a treasure, but to understanding who Grandpa Joe really was, what his world looked like, what wisdom he'd been trying to pass down. This was worth more than any amount of money they could have left me. They used to laugh so hard when I'd mention Grandpa Joe's stories about hidden secrets. Jake would practically shout, "That's all in your head, Ben." But now those secrets were revealing themselves to me, one by one, and each discovery felt like a quiet but very real victory over their skepticism. I could almost feel Grandpa Joe's smile, like he was sitting nearby with his afternoon tea, watching my progress with that knowing look he always had. Every solved puzzle was him saying, "I knew you'd get it, kid. Keep going." When I found the second clue hidden behind an old painting of Boston Harbor from a century ago, I felt that rush of excitement you get when you're finally making progress on something impossible. But what I didn't realize was that I was still just scratching the surface. The third clue took me upstairs to what used to be Grandpa Joe's office, where he kept his most important papers. Hidden inside his old desk drawer, taped to the underside, was another piece of the puzzle. This one was different, more detailed, with what looked like architectural drawings of the house itself. But these weren't the original blueprints. These showed secret passages, hidden rooms, concealed spaces that weren't on any official plan. Grandpa Joe had basically redesigned his own house to become a treasure vault, and nobody in the family had ever suspected a thing. The fourth clue led me to the kitchen behind the old cast-iron stove that hadn't been used in probably 20 years. There was a loose brick that had clearly been removed and replaced many times over the years. Inside that hiding spot was another message, this one more cryptic than the others. It referenced dates, measurements, and something about where the past meets the present. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about finding hidden objects. It was about understanding history, about connecting dots that most people would never even notice. Each step of this journey was teaching me something new about my grandfather, but also about myself. I was using skills I didn't even know I had, making connections that my years at the bookstore had prepared me for without me realizing it. All those hours I spent learning about paper types, binding techniques, printing methods, historical context, everything my family considered useless trivia was now the key to solving Grandpa Joe's masterpiece puzzle. The fifth clue brought me back to the library, but this time to a section I'd barely touched. His collection of local Boston history. Boring stuff that most people would flip through once and forget. But hidden inside a 1940 city directory was another encrypted message, and this one made my heart race. It included specific measurements and architectural details that could only refer to one location in the house. The attic, not just anywhere in the attic, but a specific wall that, according to Grandpa Joe's notes, wasn't what it appeared to be. I climbed those creaky stairs with my flashlight, feeling like I was ascending to some kind of finale. The attic smelled like every old New England attic, mothballs, dust, and decades of stored memories slowly decomposing to heat and cold. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I made my way to the wall Grandpa Joe had described. At first glance, it looked completely normal, just old wooden planks like everywhere else in the attic. But when I examined it more closely, following his precise instructions, I could see what he meant. There was a barely visible line running vertically along one section of the wall. It wasn't a crack or natural with grain. It was a deliberate cut, so perfectly made that you'd never notice it unless you knew exactly what to look for. This was it, the moment of truth. I either believed in this completely, or I was about to prove that I'd been chasing fantasies like everyone said. I started carefully prying at the wall section. The wood creaked and complained, sending dust clouds into the air that made me cough and squint. Every movement had to be precise. I felt like a bomb disposal expert working on something that could either explode into success or complete failure. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. This was either total triumph or another disappointment that would just confirm what everyone already thought about me being a dreamer who couldn't face reality. And then, like the universe had perfect timing for maximum drama, my phone rang. Jake, of course. His voice had that syrupy tone he used when he wanted to sound helpful while actually being condescending. Hey, Ben, still digging around in Grandpa's dusty old books? Listen, I've got a buddy who deals in used books. He could probably take them off your hands for a few bucks. Won't be much, but at least you'd get something for your trouble. His words hit me like ice water. They were full of that dismissive attitude that had been poisoning my confidence for years. For a second, I felt doubt creeping in. What if there really was nothing behind this wall? What if I was about to look like an even bigger fool than they already thought I was? What if Jake was right, and I was just some loser playing treasure hunter in a dead man's attic? But then I closed my eyes and saw Grandpa Joe's face. His smile, his absolute faith in me, his certainty that I was capable of things others couldn't see. And I thought about Emily's words, "You're going nowhere fast." No, I couldn't give up now. I had to prove them wrong. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about honoring the one person who'd always believed I was special. It was about that part of me that still believed in miracles, even after everything that had gone wrong. I went back to work on that wall, feeling my anger transform into determination. The wall section finally gave way, revealing a hidden compartment that was bigger than I'd expected. Not just a small hiding spot, but an actual secret room that had been completely concealed behind false walls. Inside that hidden space, carefully preserved and protected from time and weather, was something that made my hands shake. Documents, maps, prints, artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum, not in someone's attic. Each item was carefully wrapped and stored, with handwritten notes in Grandpa Joe's distinctive script explaining what they were and why they mattered. This wasn't just a collection. It was a curated treasure trove of American history, assembled by someone who understood value in ways that most people never would. Every piece told a story, and together they painted a picture of our country's past that I'd never seen before. He probably started gathering these pieces decades ago, maybe not knowing who'd find them eventually, but trusting that someone would be curious enough and persistent enough to solve his puzzle. I sat there in that dusty attic, surrounded by genuine historical treasures, feeling like an archaeologist who'd just made the discovery of a lifetime. This was what Grandpa Joe had been trying to tell us all along. This was why he'd seemed so mysterious about his hobbies, why he'd been so secretive about what he was really doing with all that time everyone thought he was wasting. He hadn't been wasting anything. He'd been building something incredible, something that would change everything for the person smart enough and patient enough to find it. But even as I marveled at what I discovered, I knew finding the treasure was one thing. Figuring out what to do with it was going to be a whole different challenge. And yet, sitting there surrounded by history itself, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. My family thought they knew what success looked like, but they'd been measuring with the wrong ruler all along. Soon, they'd learned that my grandfather's junk was worth more than all their conventional achievements combined. Soon, they'd learned that my grandfather's junk was worth more than all their conventional achievements combined. But first, I had to figure out exactly what I was looking at in that dusty attic. My hands were literally shaking as I opened that secret compartment. This wasn't gold or diamonds like in the movies. Inside were carefully packaged collections of antique prints and maps, each one stored in protective cases, preserved in perfect condition despite decades of hiding. Every single piece was a masterpiece, a small window into the past. There were maps showing early colonial settlements, engravings of historical figures I'd only read about in textbooks, sketches of battles that shaped our nation. This wasn't just old artwork. This was living history, breathing right there in my hands. I knew immediately that this wasn't just old paper like my family would have called it. These were priceless historical artifacts, some of which had been considered lost for centuries. They captured key moments in American history, from the first settlers to the birth of our nation. This was what every historian dreams of finding, what every collector would kill for. I was looking at them and couldn't believe my eyes. It was like discovering a missing chapter from your favorite history book that suddenly came to life in front of you. My grandfather, the family weirdo, had done it. He preserved genuine treasure. Not just treasure, legacy. When I saw those engravings, my knees literally buckled. This was impossible. This was real treasure that had been sitting here for decades, and nobody knew about it. In that moment, I felt not just joy, but enormous pride in Grandpa Joe. He wasn't just a dreamer. He was a visionary. And I, his grandson who'd been digging through junk, was worthy of his trust. I thought that was it. I'd found the treasure and could start celebrating. Maybe throw a big party and rub it in everyone's faces. But I was wrong. The real test, the real challenge to my persistence and faith in myself, was just getting started. Finding the treasure was one thing. Proving its value to the world was going to be a completely different adventure. First thing I did was reach out to respected experts, museums, auction houses, people who lived and breathed history the same way I did. At first, they were skeptical, just like my family, probably thinking, here's another treasure hunter with his grandmother's doilies. But when I opened those cases, when they saw the collection, their faces completely changed. Skepticism gave way to shock, then to genuine amazement. They were stunned, like I'd pulled a white rabbit out of my sleeve that turned out to be a golden dragon. One professor, Dr. Arthur Whitman, this silver-haired guy with wire-rimmed glasses who was a living legend in the world of historical prints, actually started crying when he saw one of the maps showing early Boston. He whispered, his voice trembling with excitement, that this was part of our national heritage, that I couldn't even imagine what I'd discovered. This particular map had been considered lost since the Revolutionary War. Hearing those words from someone whose opinion actually mattered, that was the moment everything became real. The experts confirmed what I'd suspected. Some of these pieces were unique, believed lost to fires or time. My supposedly pointless obsession with old books, which everyone had dismissed as a waste of time, turned out to be my greatest asset. This wasn't just luck. This was the result of my knowledge, my passion, my belief that value isn't always measured in dollars. That's what allowed me to recognize treasure where others saw only junk. Then the phone calls started coming. Museums, private collectors, people who wanted to add these rare pieces to their collections. Every call, every meeting lifted me higher. Ben, who yesterday had been a failure, suddenly became the center of attention, the guy who'd made a historical discovery. I could feel my life transforming completely. This wasn't just financial success. This was recognition. Recognition that I wasn't a loser, but someone who could see what others couldn't. I was no longer the guy whose girlfriend dumped him and whose family looked down on him. I was the one who'd found lost history. Or more accurately, the one who'd allowed history to find him. If your heart is beating faster right now, you get it. You understand that fate, like an old book, only reveals its secrets to those who truly search. This is a truth about how the American dream becomes reality, and how sometimes your biggest failures can become your greatest victories. But the real moment of truth came when I had to decide what to do with this discovery. I got several offers, each one bigger than I could have imagined. This wasn't an easy decision, because it wasn't just about money. It was about Grandpa Joe's legacy, about history itself. I chose the best offer, from the Library of Congress. They didn't just want to buy the collection. They wanted to preserve it for history, make it accessible to everyone. This wasn't just money. It was validation. Validation of my passion, my knowledge. Validation of Grandpa Joe's genius. The contract was signed. My hands weren't shaking, but my heart was still pounding like crazy. When that notification appeared on my phone screen showing the wire transfer, I couldn't breathe. $50 million. I stared at that number and couldn't believe it. This was an amount I'd never dreamed of, not even in my wildest fantasies. Well, Ben, I thought, your junk is now worth more than all their promising businesses combined. This wasn't just financial triumph. It was a triumph of my faith. Faith in Grandpa Joe. Faith in myself. Faith that real value always finds its way. When I saw that number on my screen, my knees gave out. These were real millions. My millions. I stood there unable to believe my own eyes. This was the moment that changed everything forever. I didn't become a different person, but my place in the world had shifted. And that feeling, that was better than any amount of money. The next family dinner was something else. As always, my parents and brother started their favorite record about my lack of prospects, about how I needed to find a real job, about wasting my life on old books. I sat there, listened, smiled internally, and calmly let them finish. I even played along a little, asking about their successful ventures. Then, when it was my turn, I calmly announced the sale of Grandpa Joe's collection, like I was talking about the weather. I watched their faces change. My brother, who'd just been bragging about his new car, stopped chewing. My parents, who'd always looked at me with pity, suddenly stared wide-eyed. I pulled out my phone and calmly showed them the screenshot of my bank account. Their faces went white. Jaws dropped. The silence was so complete, you could hear a fly buzzing. It was the best silence of my life. I took a slow sip of water, savoring every second. And then, in that perfect moment, my phone rang. Emily, my ex-fiancée. She'd obviously heard about my success through mutual friends. Her voice was sweet, gentle, full of fake regret and a desire to make up. She said she'd been worried about me, that she always knew I could do it, that we should talk. I calmly told her I was in the middle of managing a historical collection and didn't have time for reunions, and hung up. I didn't feel anger, just complete, overwhelming peace and victory. I looked at my relatives, at their amazed faces. They sat there like they'd been nailed to their chairs. I didn't feel anger. I felt incredible pride. I'd proven to all of them that they were wrong. I felt something invincible boiling up inside me. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. This was a victory of my passion, my knowledge, my faith in myself. I, the failure, had done it. I, the bookworm who was supposed to live in dust, had found my diamond. If Grandpa Joe were alive, he'd be smiling proudly right now. Maybe he'd say, "Remember, Ben, real treasure doesn't always shine. You just have to know how to see it." I still smile when I think about that moment. Not because I proved them wrong, but because I proved Grandpa Joe right. That passion matters. That knowledge matters. That treasure doesn't always shine. And if you're willing to look where others don't, the American dream might just be waiting for you too.